Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, I'm here this week with Gib van Ert. He's a litigator in Ottawa and Vancouver, and he was the executive legal officer at the Supreme Court of Canada from 2015 to 2018. And we're here to talk more about these convoys and the occupations and the blockades that have resulted. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting is to tease out a little bit more about this notion of the injunctions that keep happening now in Ottawa and Windsor in particular. Groups have gone to court to get injunctions to make the police do their jobs, and this is going to have a knock-on effect on the rule of law. So Gib has some thoughts about this, and so I'll kind of turn it over.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dale. I think when we're talking about the injunctions, we have to draw a distinction between injunctions that are sought by private citizens and injunctions that are sought by governments, right? Yeah. There shouldn't be any need for a government to seek an injunction requiring people to obey existing laws, right? Yeah. Now, that's a completely different situation than the injunction that was obtained a week or so ago now, the anti-honking injunction that Paul Champ and Emily Taman got, because that was a private citizen who lived in the area, and she had no power to compel people to behave unless a court gave her an order to that effect, right? So I don't take any, I don't make any criticism of that sort of injunction.
Right. And just for clarity's sake, that was attached to a class action lawsuit that's also being launched against the people in that occupation. So just for clarity's sake there.
Right, that's right. It was an interlocutory injunction in the course of that proceeding. And to me, that's a very different situation than when a government goes to court and asks for an injunction, right? Yeah. And when that happens, you have to ask yourself, and I expect the judges will be asking the government lawyers, well, why do you need the court's help to enforce the law, right? And there's no shortage of laws, right? I mean, we've got criminal mischief provisions, criminal nuisance provisions, unlawful assembly and riot act provisions, and there's municipal bylaws that are being infringed all over the place, right? Yeah. So there's no shortage of books to throw at these people. And that's why, in passing, when Premier Ford announced was it yesterday? The days are all blurring, that he would bring some new legislation before the House at Queen's Park. I think, well, why do we need new laws? We need enforcement of existing laws. What's lacking isn't law. It's government will, and especially police will, it seems, to give effect to existing laws.
Yeah, and I had the same particular feeling when they passed new laws about harassing healthcare workers. It's like, well, you don't need specific laws for that. You just need police to apply the existing laws against nuisance and trespass and harassment and so on. But I agree. I think we are in an era where there's kind of a feel-good sense about creating new laws about something, which I think just pollutes the statute book, but that's my own kind of personal opinion there.
Yeah, no, I share your skepticism about that, and it looks like action without being action, and that's really unsatisfying, especially if you happen to live in Ottawa right now, like you and I do.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect of the government going to seek injunctions that really worries me, which is dragging the courts into the whole mess, right? Yeah. And some people, I've seen some observers say, well, the judicial involvement is good because polls show that Canadians have more respect for the judiciary than they do for the executive. But courts and policing are not two alternative policy options, right? To the contrary, judicial power depends on effective police power, right? Yeah. They're intimately linked. And to the extent that the judicial system works at all, it really works because ultimately there is this power of coercion behind court orders, right? Yeah. There's the power of the court to order the police to go enforce a court order, and the court relies on the police to do that, right? And if suddenly that contempt power, the power of a court to find a party in contempt of a court order, if that power turns out to not be a power at all because the police just don't do what the court has ordered, that is a disaster, right? I mean, the courts go from being effective judicial bodies to being sort of advisory bodies, right?
Yeah.
And that worries me, because right now what we're seeing, I think, is the police failing to enforce laws. Why do we have greater confidence that they will enforce court orders than federal statutes or provincial statutes or municipal bylaws? It's far from clear to me that that should be so. And if it turns out that the courts are let down by the police in the same way that the rest of the public is being let down by the police right now, then we've got a real problem, because then why would anyone ever obey a court order, right? If the police aren't going to enforce it, why tell the truth in court if you can never be jailed for contempt of court, right? I mean, some people will still obey. Some people will still tell the truth because their conscience dictates it. Some people will still obey court orders because they have some sort of residual respect for the institution despite the lack of enforcement. But a lot of people won't, right? Without the threat of coercion, without the belief that the police are going to give effect to a court order if push comes to shove, respect for the judiciary will drain away. And then this problem that we're living through right now, which is I see it as a crisis in policing and even a crisis in government. Yeah. And it starts to become a judicial crisis as well. Yeah. And that makes things much worse. Yeah. So if I were a judge hearing one of these government injunction applications, I'd be very hesitant. I'd be asking a lot of questions, right? Why is this needed? And I think my inclination would be, if a government couldn't really show me why existing laws could not suffice, my inclination would be to hold the police and hold the government to their constitutional responsibilities without involving the judiciary. Just tell them to go do their jobs.
No, for sure. And you made a tweet sometime a few days ago where there was this talk about injunctions going on, and you suppose, like, what if the judge asks why they just didn't read the Riot Act first? And I think this is a very salient question. I think that there are tools that are not being used. And there's a lot of that whole Simpsons meme of "we've tried nothing and we're all out of ideas" going around, because there's just been no enforcement of just the existing laws. And I think that's kind of at the heart of what's been going on. Absolutely.
And so then you start asking, all right, well, if that's what's happening, if there's this executive/police systemic failure or crisis or whatever you want to call it, how do we at least limit it rather than letting it expand? And the moment you add failure to enforce court orders into it, then I think it gets immeasurably worse. So I'm worried about that. And it then leads us to think about, well, assuming this all does somehow resolve itself, and right now it's hard to see how that happens, but assuming it does, how then do we learn from this? And what are the lessons, and where are the failures exactly? Because, you sit here, I'm sitting a few blocks from where all this is going on right now. You probably are too. Yeah. And you got an anecdotal sense of what's gone wrong, but I don't think we have, I'm sure we do not have the kind of full picture that we're really going to need.
Yeah, and this raises the question of what kind of an inquiry are we going to need once this is all over? And there's already been some not untrue joking about that it's going to be a power struggle between whether it's going to be a federal judicial inquiry or a provincial one, and that will be where it falls apart. But aside from that, and I think there's also going to need to be at the local level with the Police Services Board, That's going to have to be where a lot of the accountability is going to have to take place. But yeah, there's going to need to be some kind of an inquiry into where the systemic failures were here.
Yeah, that's right. And I think people are going to lose their jobs. But I mean, that's probably merited. But what's more important to me at this point is figuring out where the systemic failures have been. Because I'm saying systemic failures, I think that must be right, but we don't entirely know. I mean, the first issue, I guess, is Ottawa police failure.
Yeah.
Right? And it's possible, I suppose, that it just starts and ends with the police chief, right? I suppose that could be the explanation. I sort of doubt it, but I don't know, right?
Yeah.
But you've got to ask that question. You've got to investigate that. And so, you mentioned the police services board as well. That is certainly part of the inquiry, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we all know now that it's not just the Ottawa police, that the OPP is here as well. And
the RCMP in Southern Alberta.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And are they failing as well? I mean, again, this is just me as a person who lives in Ottawa. It's not clear to me that OPP arriving has improved the situation particularly. Now, I don't want to be unfair on the OPP. I don't know, where their jurisdiction lies vis-a-vis the Ottawa police and their command structure. So I don't want to cast aspersions, but clearly this hasn't solved the problem. And so another point for the inquiry is just a general question about policing on the territory of Ottawa, whether it's Ottawa Police, OPP, RCMP. We've got to figure that out, right?
Yeah.
But I think it goes beyond police as well. I mean, I see this in part as a national security failure, right?
Yeah, to an extent, because it's created a vulnerability.
Yeah, and when I say national security failure, I mean, again, I don't know where that failure may be, right? It's possible that our national security services didn't see this coming at all, and that would be a failure. I doubt that. I suspect that they have been monitoring it. And then so maybe they did see it coming, and maybe they tried to warn the police, or they tried to warn the municipal government or the provincial government, or I don't know, right? But again, we've got to find that out. Were warnings given? Were they ignored, right? And so is there blame to be accorded to the security services, or maybe not? Maybe they're entitled to them. We've got very sophisticated people in our national security services. But the truth of the matter is, we've got a weeks long occupation of the national capital of a G7 country. To assume that the security services are in the clear on that, I don't think is wise. So we've got to ask about that. We've got to understand that better. I mean, another thing that keeps coming up, of course, in the news reports lately has been foreign influence, right? Yeah,
and particularly funding, but
right.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that should be part of the inquiry as well. I'm a little more hesitant about that, in the sense that I think it could end up being a scapegoat, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right there, because I think there is a knee-jerk impulse for people to say, oh, this is just American organizing and influence, as opposed to, no, we do have homegrown extremism in this country, and it's just being given support by Americans who are colonizing us in their ridiculous culture war. But I think,
right. I mean, you have to ask the question, to what extent was foreign influence an element? But you also have to ask the question, well, why were we susceptible to it?
Yeah.
Right. Because if we hadn't been susceptible, it would have just bounced off, right? I'm sure there are all sorts of foreign actors trying to influence democratic societies around the world, and very often they fail, right?
Yeah.
So that's part of the inquiry, but it mustn't be allowed to become an excuse.
Yeah, and I think the last portion of our discussion today is just going to be around this notion about these groups using quasi-legalese notions and orders and attempts at coercion using these mechanisms, because you've seen these in the courts, and what we've done to contain them so far, it hasn't been very effective. And you had some thoughts on that too. So I thought we should touch on that as well.
Yeah, for 20 years or more now, there's been a collection of sort of pseudo-legal theories that are sometimes known as freemen of the land or sovereign citizen.
Yeah.
And the proponents of these notions have developed all sorts of fantasies, frankly, about how the law works and how the law doesn't apply to them in various ways. And there are reported cases all over the English-speaking world where people have gone to court invoking these notions and wasting court time and public resources with, bogus claims or bogus defenses. And the courts have always ruled against them, right? So it's, in that sense, it's remained a sort of, what's that?
Consistent.
Yeah, and I think the notion, as I say, I mean, I've seen this off and on for 20 years. Practicing lawyers hear about it from time to time. We're all kind of familiar with it. Every once in a while, you go to court and there'll be one of those people there, right?
Yeah.
But it hasn't really been taken as particularly serious. It's sort of a weird fringe thing, and we have just been tolerant of it, right? And that seemed like the right approach, right? I mean, no court has ever upheld them, so that's good, right?
Yeah.
But nothing is really being done, to my knowledge, at a governmental level to try to stamp this stuff out, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think this matters is that, as you were saying, these ideas are clearly there in the convoy, right?
Yeah.
They came with their so-called MOU, where they wanted to address the Governor General and the Senate, and they've been deputizing their own so-called police and trying to arrest people and so on. There's a lot of this sort of thinking that they can kind of make up their own laws behind all of this. And I don't mean to suggest that everyone down there protesting has, these ideas, because I'm sure they don't all, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of it. I mean, that's clear, right?
There's a lot of it, and among the organizers themselves. So the other people attach themselves to this.
That's right. And there are a lot of people there, I'm sure, who don't believe in it, but are willing to tolerate it because they're concerned about vaccines and mandates and masks and so on, right?
Yeah.
So, and as I say, I mean, there's a part of me that starts to wonder whether the justice system itself hasn't made a mistake by being tolerant of it as well. We've been treating it as sort of a lunatic fringe, right? And we reject it, but we ultimately just neglect it as well, right? Yeah. And I think that's been a mistake because the ideas haven't remained on the fringe. I mean, they're not mainstream yet, but there's a lot of people down the street from me now, like hundreds or thousands possibly, certainly hundreds, who are to some degree deluded about how law works and about how politics works. And it's, I think that's what it is. It's sort of a mass delusion about law and politics. And it's different than a political movement, right? Freemen of the land and the things that we're seeing here, it's not a proposal for reform, right? It's not, an expression of political ideas that we can take seriously. It's fundamental mistakes about how the whole system actually works, right? And it's hard to distinguish between those two things, right? Because we want to vindicate people's freedom of expression and freedom of thought and freedom of belief, right? But at the same time, there are characteristics of this that resemble more a mental health condition than a political movement, Yeah. And I suspect that we could learn more about how it spreads and how it's grown in Canadian society from epidemiologists than we can from political scientists, Yeah,
that's an interesting thought.
And I think we need to take it seriously. I mean, one thing we do seem to know is that it spreads over social media.
Yeah.
Right.
It certainly has come a long way from weekend seminars and people signing up for fax notifications. The internet has made it much more available and I think almost more credible in certain circumstances as well.
I think that's right. And so if that's true, then what do we do to actually contain it and reverse it, right? I mean, you see a lot of people on the internet, and maybe I've even been guilty of it. I don't know, maybe of just sort of treating this as outbreak of mass stupidity and just insulting people's intelligence. Oh, of course you can't have an MOU, and what makes you think you can talk to the Governor General, and don't be so dumb, right? But I think just treating it, just insulting people's stupidity here is not a solution, and it really misses the point about what's going on, right? I think it's a outbreak of mass delusion, and we have to, if we approach it that way and start thinking systematically about, well, how is it that so many people who are no doubt in all other respects law-abiding citizens and good neighbors and reasonable people have come to think that this is how politics and law works in this country? I mean, that's, if we approach it that way with a bit more subtlety and introspection about what's actually going on instead of just insulting people, I think we're more likely to actually address the problem. So I think that's got to be part of the inquiry as well, is what are the radically flawed sort of misinformation ideas about law and politics that are supporting some of this, and what, if anything, can we do to correct that and contain that, and do it while still respecting people's rights and freedoms to express themselves and have their own beliefs, right? I mean, I'm not saying this is easy, right? This is not easy. This is difficult, but I think we've got to tackle it. I don't think we can just keep pretending that this is something on the fringes. It's developing.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. This was really interesting, but also really kind of disturbing as to where some of these thought lines go. So that's going to be some really good food for thought for the next few weeks. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Dale.
All right. Cheers.
Bye.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.